Greetings! Continuing from last time. How can we explain why some people can be so goddamn evil? And why, in fact, so many people can be so evil? So Kant told us not to bother working it out. He might have a point. So he says human beings are responsible for the choices they make, but ultimately we cannot explain why they make the moral choices they do. Not only is this inscrutable, it must be inscrutable because this is what it means to be a free and responsible person. So does this help us, and how does this relate to this part of phenomenology? Okay, so Kant's position regarding the ultimate unknown behind human motivation. I think it's a strength rather than a weakness in his doctrine of radical evil. So human action often does have this like imponderable thing you can't get behind. This strange quality, unknowable. So the ubiquity of social media means that with a click or a swipe, we can see examples of humans committing horrendous acts of just straightforward evil. I don't mean radical evil, I mean just vile stuff, okay, upon innocent people. And mostly, we're just at a loss to explain, aren't we, why they did these terrible things. So we use the word evil. That's the common terminology for the thing really, but you can't explain it. No one can, I don't think. So even though most ordinary people seem to be capable of the most horrendous deeds, and some people think that it's one of Kant's strengths that he recognised this troubling aspect of humanity. So Kant said, you know, don't think about working that one out, mate. And I do see his points, but I can't follow him all the way on this one. So sometimes we've got to try and look behind this veil of inscrutability. So Kant's position on the inscrutability or unknowability of freedom goes back as far as St. Augustine in the City of God. So Augustine warns the Christian community against trying to search for explanations for why people do evil. So the truth is that one should not try to find an efficient cause for a wrong choice. That's St. Augustine. So Kant's account of radical evil is not a theory of why we commit acts of evil. And for some, this is obviously and understandably inadequate, because what they and maybe most of us want from a theory of evil, it's an explanation of why people do perpetrate evil acts. And when we look at for a why, we usually look at the context, because context matters. It's not just about the pure will. People don't get killed in abstraction. There are always concrete circumstances around death, violent death. So we therefore need to look not just at the will or the intention of the individual committing the evil act in abstraction. We need the context and the circumstances in which the act was committed. So we've got to look at the social. Let me just have a drink because I'm parched. For example, so we live in hierarchical societies, class societies. How do social hierarchies, how does class impact upon individual behaviours? Massively, I think. So from Rousseau onwards, many thinkers have suggested that humans are born good, but are twisted by class society and inequality. Man is born free, but everywhere is in chains. That's Rousseau. But he didn't want to think too deeply about what evil was. He was just interested in our practical applications, practical cases, concrete cases. So man is naturally good, and that it is from these institutions alone that men become wicked. He says, nature made man happy and good, but society depraves him and makes him miserable. So Rousseau's position was a radical departure from existing theories on the subject, which maintained that human nature was at best mixed, and to Thomas Hobbes, it was nasty. In relation to the context of evil at some point, I want to introduce a particular case. It's a famous case, Adolf Eichmann, and a particular philosopher, Hannah Arendt. So Arendt thought that radical evil had nothing to do with inner sinful motives or selfishness or the Ten Commandments, or I don't think even she agreed with Rousseau about that humanity without society is a fountain of goodness. I don't think she thought that. But one aspect of her understanding of evil, which I won't go into here, is the systematic production of superfluity. Now, I just didn't really understand what she was on about, so I'll skip that. I thought it was a bit silly, I didn't buy it, but I want to move on to the more interesting aspect. She's most famous probably for explaining how totalitarian societies undermine morality itself and make the will almost redundant. This is their strongest point, and I think a lot of it is unarguable. But as I said before, the human being is a social achievement. I think also that's what Arendt's view was. It's historical. And in previous videos in this series about how we've done the nature of personhood, and we call, oh, that's right. So I talked about John Locke in a previous video, and I said that Locke separated what we call personality from any kind of spiritual inner self, because the self was seen as being an eternal thing, and we just materialise on earth with our spirit, and it's the same after we're dead. But what Kant says, how do you account for personality? Because personality you acquire through circumstance, and then you forget stuff and people lose the memory. So that personality can't be eternal, and this caused a big stink in philosophical terms, and he made a really brilliant point. Okay, Arendt makes a similar point from the relative and unstable character of our personhood. Because we change, don't we? Our personalities can change massively. I've always been great, that's the other thing, but most people can vary throughout their lives. Anyway, her great insight was to argue that the first step on the road to totalitarianism, this is a key insight, I want to emphasize this. The first step on the road to totalitarianism is to kill the judicial or the juridical person. The legal person. So in the case of 1930s, that meant 1930s Germany, that meant legal restrictions that stripped the Jews of their rights. Modern people, or rather modern individuality, exists within a legal framework of rights and laws. And when they no longer exist, the Enlightenment individual, pictured by Kant, he's trying to follow the categorical imperative, and like we all try and do, but once the legal framework goes, that's it. The modern person doesn't exist. You can't go on Twitter in China, you can't go on Facebook, you can't protest, you can't even speak to your mate in case you get thrown in prison. So all of these freedoms, and I will make these choices, that goes. What you are as a person disappears. And that's when people are trying to understand totalitarian societies. Oh, the Iranians and the Houthis, they're trying to do stuff. You can't understand it because the legal part, this thing that emerged in Western Europe, you can't apply it to the Houthis. You just can't do it. In terms of the history is so different. Okay. That doesn't mean that personality doesn't exist in another sense, and that individuals don't exist and characters don't exist. But this complex network of rights that's been created by society, that's fundamental. And if you don't have that, you lose. That's essentially the roads on, as I mentioned, with the Jews when they were destroyed. And there's a further step in destroying the person, and that's to kill the moral person. And that involves debasing any form of human activity, human solidarity. Anything at all. So you've got to be forced to, so they give you the choice, kill your wife or kill your child, or we'll kill 2 of your children and keep one alive, according to the camps. That's what happened in the camps with the Nazis. Being a member of a Sonderkommando unit where you've got to make the dead go into the gas chambers, those kind of things. Morality didn't exist in the camps. They killed the moral person. So the person, essentially, you reduce to nothingness. The will is nothing. Moral choice becomes nothing. Ethics become nothing. The architecture and design of the concentration camps made the choices between good and evil of the inmate completely irrelevant. And that is, I think, Arendt's genius on this point. Arendt said, totalitarianism has discovered a means of dominating and terrorizing human beings from within, which is why in this video series, I keep coming back to it. So Kant and Arendt are tied together, I think. Kant thought deeply about evil, and his moral philosophy was influential, in Western thought, because it assumed that the solution to humanity's problems would be the ultimate triumph of reason over superstition. That's what his main message was. And they're tied together in the person of one of the major designers of the Nazi Holocaust, who was Adolf Eichmann. And how's that? Well, unbelievably, Eichmann used Kant's teachings to defend his role in the systematic running of the extermination camps. And this was exemplified in the famous phrase that we all use today, I was only following orders. Apparently, Eichmann wanted to use more of Kant's philosophy in his defense than he actually did in his trial, but he was dissuaded by his defense counsel. He was going to go big on Kant. But in any case, when we think of like basically Kant's reverence for morality, and most sane people would just go, you know, he'd have been horrified by this. We can't go back in history, but it'd been terrible. He'd have said no chance that these Nazi death camps. And he'd be turning his grave if people associated his ideas. Eichmann, using his name and, as a justification for mass murder. Now, and I'm with Arendt on the camps and now the eradication of, as I said, the juridical person that can annihilate all personality and morality. I'm also with her on how people in bureaucracies can follow orders without thinking. She's right, but she ain't right on Eichmann. She's not right, she's wrong. And I'm going to come to it. Now, although he wasn't a great scholar, Eichmann had read quite a bit of Immanuel Kant. I don't know how he did it because it's hard going. But when he was on trial in Jerusalem in 1961, Eichmann told the court this: with the killing of the Jews, I had nothing to do. I never killed a Jew, or a non-Jew for that matter. I never killed any human being. I never gave an order to kill a Jew or a non-Jew. I just did not do it. That's Adolf Eichmann. By the way, she bought this. Arendt bought this, even though she was this great philosopher. Now, what struck her, I think this is a quote, Arendt about Eichmann, was his shallowness. This is a quote. She refused to describe as radical the conduct of a man who struck her as totally superficial. But she went on to claim that he had no intent to do wrong, that he lost the ability to distinguish from right and wrong, and that nothing would have been further from his mind than to determine with Richard III to prove a villain. Eichmann, she concluded, was guilty of sheer thoughtlessness. Okay, so this view of Eichmann as a thoughtless bureaucrat, simply following orders without a flicker of reflection, that's a terrifying picture. And as I said, I probably think there is a lot of truth contained in this, namely that bureaucrats in totalitarian societies can do horrible, terrifyingly evil things. And even in democratic society, if you're caught in a very hierarchical system, as I said, the post office or Ofsted, you can do horrible things to people within an institution. And it's easy to make people to do horrible things. Not everyone will do it, by the way, but there's a tendency, the ability to do it is there. But in the specific case of Eichmann, this is a false explanation. The faceless mediocrity like Eichmann, who personifies totalitarianism, it's a tempting account of evil, isn't it? And many have been tempted by this concept. Just before his trial, Eichmann acknowledged to his Israeli interrogator that he lived according to the categorical imperative. He said he'd made some mistakes, but he said, apparently he said he lived, this is what he said, I lived according to the demand by Kant, which I long assumed as my guiding principle. I fashioned my life according to this demand. And the judge at his trial, according to asked him what he meant by his statement that he tried to live according to the categorical imperative, Kant's imperative. Eichmann replied this: that the basis of my will and the pattern of my life should be such that at all times I should be a universal example of lawfulness. This is what I more or less understood by it. And Hannah Arendt said that this was a perfectly adequate, unprofessional, but an adequate description of Kant's views. Eichmann said that he recognized the conflict between the requirements of the categorical imperative not to harm and Hitler's orders for the extermination of the Jews. But he claimed that the categorical imperative included the duty of obedience to the authority of the state. And what is weird is that Kant's view on the citizen's obligations to the sovereign, to the state, that's supported by Eichmann's position. Oh, it's gone cloudy. In theory and practice, Kant argues uncompromisingly that it's a citizen's duty to obey established law. Using an extreme case to make the point, he writes this, he says, so Kant says, if a law is so framed that all the people could not possibly give their consent, as for example, a law granting the hereditary privilege of master status to a certain class of subjects, the law is unjust. But if it is at all possible that a people might agree upon it, then the people's duty is to look upon the law as just. Kant writes that a certain actual legislation will with the utmost probability deprive them of their happiness. What can such people do? Should they not resist? The answer can only be, they can do nothing but obey. For the question is not what happiness the subject may expect from the establishment of a community or from its administration. Rather, the issue is first of all the legal order, which is thereby to be secured for all. So Kant understood that lawmakers may make terrible laws, but the existence of civil society under the law, it was so important for him that any resistance to the supreme lawmaking power, any incitement of dissatisfied subjects to action, any uprising that bursts into rebellion, that all of this is the worst, most punishable crime in a community's foundations. And this ban is absolute, so unconditional, that even though the supreme power or agent, the head of state, may have broken the original contract, even though in the subject's eyes he may have forfeited the right to legislate by empowering the government to rule tyrannically by sheer violence, even then, the subject is allowed no resistance, no violent counteraction. The reason is that once a civil constitution exists, a people no longer have the right to judge how that constitution ought to be administered. If Eichmann had known of the existence, and he didn't, of this particular work of Kant, he could easily have introduced it into court in his defense and claim he was simply following orders because what he was following Kant in his duty to obey Hitler, and Hitler was representative of the state. Now, some scholars have tried to get Kant off the hook by claiming that because the Nazi regime was founded on violence, its laws and justice system are therefore illegitimate, and that even for Kant, he would say people would have the right to resist in these circumstances, in the circumstances of illegitimate power. Unfortunately, there are problems with this because Hitler was made chancellor according to the law and under the constitution. Furthermore, Trump was elected, wasn't he? And maybe elected again. So, furthermore, President Hindenburg did have the authority to suspend the constitution, and Hitler had the right as a chancellor to ask him to do it. If the Nazi state had been introduced by force, then perhaps Kantians should argue that people would have been not just morally but legally obligated to oppose it. So I'm not going off on a Kantian tangent here. Well, I suppose I am a bit, but what's important in phenomenology in this section of the spirit a little bit later in examining the conflict between acting consciousness, Kant will describe it, and judging consciousness. This is what he's going to describe these two. Can I resist the state or do I have to follow the laws? These are the two things that Kant confronts head on. So that's in 662 onwards, paragraph 666. But the reason that Kant doesn't allow individuals to interpret the law according to individual conscience is that there would be anarchy, because society would be a chaotic mess of conflicting wills and therefore conflicting laws. Last word on Eichmann in a moment, but on the point of the right to resist bad laws, we're going to look at why in the section on conscience, using the example of Sophocles' Antigone, she was the great lawbreaker, and Creon, the voice of the sovereign, the state. That's going to exemplify the conflict between lawful authority and conscientious objection. One of the implications of Hegel's view of evil, which overlaps somewhat with Kant, is his vision of forgiveness as well. So can we really say that the horrors we witness and are subjected to are part of a spiritual, moral journey of humanity? Is this what we mean by the dialectic of history? Also Marx as well, I think. So is human suffering and or genocide even, is that part of a dialectical unfolding? Is a part of a development on humanity's journey? And can we really expect all atrocities to be, or all phenomenon to be, Hegel's word, sublated? That means transcended. Is that sublation, this transcendence, part of the process? You could argue, Hegel is arguing for that. Don't worry about that, bad stuff happens and we'll get over it. And if Hegel meant that, then I'm not with him, but I'm not sure. I think that what we can learn from suffering and the dialectic or the concept of progress, and I believe in progress, definitely believe in it, and there are big caveats with it, but suffering doesn't just happen to those who are physically present. This is my take. It doesn't just happen to those who are subjected to unjustifiable violence. I think it's transmitted in many cases down the generations. And for example, there's lots of people on this planet who still are pissed off about the Crusades. And that was over 1,000 years ago. I read Ari Shavat's book, My Promised Land. And he describes on the early 20th century, some of Israel's founders hiked to the top of the mountain fortress Masada, which was the site of the suicidal Jewish last stand and resistance against the Romans. And he writes about how these early pioneers were tremendously moved and influenced simply by being on the same location of the site of the Roman siege and Jewish resistance and suffering. So the pain doesn't go away. And when the dead no longer feel it, it's still with us. And although I don't think there's much optimism, I suppose, in phenomenology, because it's about moving forward in history, it just doesn't explain this feature of human loss. I should say that it is in some ways it is optimistic, and Marx and stuff like that, and I'm generally with it. But human loss, how do you explain it? And it's persistence. So anyway, Walter Benjamin, he had this kind of different view. He suggests that cultural history has never done justice to the negative or the barbaric aspect of culture, and that reparation's not really, you can't solve the problem. Anyway, moving on. Eichmann, back to Adolf Eichmann. Since Hannah Arendt wrote Ever Since Eichmann in Jerusalem, a report of the banality of evil, you'll have heard that phrase, banality of evil. She wrote it in 1963. Almost every philosophical, deep-thinking article about the Holocaust has been unable to avoid the book. Arendt went to Jerusalem in 1961 for Eichmann's trial. So she expected Eichmann to be a cartoon villain, but like everyone else, she was disappointed in the flesh because he had no charisma and he just didn't look evil. So Bettina Strangner's book, Eichmann Before Jerusalem, says that Arendt fell into his trap. Eichmann in Jerusalem was little more than a mask. She didn't recognize it, although she was acutely aware that she had not understood the phenomenon as well as she'd hoped to. She depicted Eichmann as simply thoughtless. He was not possessed by a demonic spirit nor malicious intent. Evil, however, as personified by the so-called pen pusher Eichmann, was neither so banal nor so blindly bureaucratic as Arendt assumed it was. Because taped interviews with Eichmann, the Sasson interviews, have become available to us since the trial. And after Arendt's death, and we can now see that Arendt didn't see and she didn't hear, Eichmann was no passive office boy. He wasn't just following orders. The tape recordings of Eichmann reveal him to be a vicious, megalomaniacal psychopath who reveled in what he did. He used to like walking around in Nazi uniform and ordering people around and other stuff. So the categorical imperative, bullshit. My arse, all this. Kant, I was just following orders, right? It was all a game. It was all a charade. And Hannah Arendt fell for it, hook, line and sinker. Eichmann was an actor simply trying to save his own skin, and a total and complete bastard who enjoyed every moment of his knee-length Nazi boot, goose-stepping, horrible existence. The whole Kantian thing, the helpless bureaucrat, he's unable to analyse the enormity of his actions because he's just doing his job and he doesn't reflect, he doesn't go home and reflect. That's crap. This leads us back. It's a show. It's a show. This leads us back to Kant and the inscrutability of evil. So when we look behind the mask, what do we see? Is there a mask to look behind? What can we really know about human motivations and radical evil? Of course, totalitarianism degrades the individual. That is absolutely true. I buy that. And that allows tremendous evil to happen. I buy that as well. But in the case of Eichmann, although he wouldn't have been allowed, if Nazism wasn't there, he wouldn't have been allowed to fulfill his desires and his fantasies without the Nazi regime. But when we look at his individual responsibility, we're still left staring into the void about the inscrutability of human action. So it's a paradox because it seems so simple to describe evil, but it's still really difficult to explain it. Okay, so enough from me. See you later. Bye.